She's not dying. She can wait. The words landed in the waiting room like a dropped glass, sharp enough to make heads turn and quiet enough to reveal exactly what kind of place this was. At 7:12 on a gray Monday morning in downtown Chicago, the Priority Care Center was supposed to be opening another routine day. Soft, instrumental music drifted through hidden ceiling speakers. Fresh coffee steamed beside the reception desk. Television screens scrolled health tips no one was reading. Then one sentence changed the atmosphere. Naomi Carter sat 3 rows from the front, one hand resting lightly against her chest after a delayed cross-country flight and a sleepless night. She wore dark jeans, a simple navy sweater, and white sneakers. No jewelry, no designer handbag, no visible signs of status. Just another black woman waiting for medical attention, at least in the eyes of the people behind the counter. The nurse who had spoken, Melissa Grant, never bothered lowering her voice. "Priority appointments are reserved for qualifying patients," she said, turning back toward her computer. "She can wait with everyone else." Several people glanced toward Naomi. A middle-aged man near the coffee station frowned. An older woman slowly lowered her magazine. Nobody said anything. Most people never did. Naomi remained seated. Calm. Motionless. The kind of calm that made some people uncomfortable. She had seen this before. Not the building. Not the faces. The pattern. The assumption. The decision made before a single question had been asked. Melissa clicked through screens while another patient approached the desk. A white businessman who had entered nearly 10 minutes after Naomi. "Mr. Harrison?" Melissa's voice suddenly brightened. "We'll get you right in." Naomi watched as he was escorted through the secured door without delay. The room noticed it too. The difference was obvious. The explanation was not. A young receptionist sitting beside Melissa shifted uneasily in her chair, but stayed silent. Across the room, a mother holding a toddler looked from Naomi to the desk and back again. Something felt wrong. The air itself seemed heavier now. Naomi glanced toward the wall clock. 7:15. 3 minutes had passed. Not long enough to matter medically. Long enough to reveal character. Melissa called another name. Then another. None belonged to Naomi. Her file remained untouched on the corner of the counter. A small thing. Easy to miss. Unless you were looking for it. Naomi was. She had not come here expecting kindness. She had come looking for truth. For weeks, anonymous complaints had been arriving at corporate headquarters. Stories about delayed treatment. Selective enforcement of policies. Patients who felt invisible. Reports that disappeared before reaching compliance teams. Patterns buried beneath paperwork. Most executives would have delegated the investigation. Naomi never did. If she wanted to understand a system, she stepped inside it. A door opened down the hallway. A patient emerged smiling after being seen. Another was called immediately. Melissa glanced toward Naomi again. Her expression tightened. The look lasted only a second. But Naomi recognized it instantly. She had seen that look years ago in hotel lobbies, boardrooms, and airport lounges. Different place. Same message. You don't belong here. The waiting room remained quiet. Yet beneath the silence, something had already begun. And before the next 7 minutes were over, every person in that building would wish they had chosen a different way to start the morning. Naomi Carter did not look at the clock again. She already knew what time it was. What interested her was not the delay. It was the pattern. Patterns told the truth long before people did. She sat quietly while the waiting room continued its slow morning rhythm. Patients checked their phones. Coffee cups emptied. Nurses moved through secured doors carrying tablets and charts. On the surface, everything looked normal. That was exactly the problem. Most systems that failed people did not look broken. They looked efficient. Naomi folded her hands and watched. Another patient approached the desk. Another was escorted through. Melissa Grant smiled, nodded, and welcomed them with the polished confidence of someone who believed she controlled the room. Yet every interaction revealed something. Every choice left a footprint. Naomi had spent 20 years building healthcare organizations across the country. She knew compliance reports. She knew patient satisfaction surveys. She knew legal audits. More importantly, she knew human behavior. And human behavior was often more honest than paperwork. 3 weeks earlier, an anonymous letter had arrived at headquarters. Then another. Then 5 more. Different names. Different stories. Same facility. Same complaints. Delayed care. Selective treatment. Missing reports. Patients who felt dismissed before anyone reviewed their medical needs. The allegations had been serious enough to trigger concern, but not serious enough to trigger proof. That was why Naomi was here. Not as a CEO, not as an executive, just another patient walking through the front door. At least that had been the plan. Across the room, a young employee glanced repeatedly toward the reception desk. Her identification badge read Emily Brooks. She looked barely 25, new enough to still care, experienced enough to notice when something was wrong. Naomi saw her studying the computer screen, then looking back toward Melissa. A brief hesitation crossed the young woman's face. Then she looked away. Interesting. The waiting room television switched to a weather forecast. Outside, light rain tapped against the glass entrance. Inside, the atmosphere felt colder. Melissa suddenly reached for Naomi's file. For a moment it appeared she might finally process it. Instead, she slid it beneath a stack of paperwork and turned her attention elsewhere. The movement lasted less than 2 seconds. Naomi noticed. So did Emily. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Emily quickly looked down. 7:20. 8 minutes since Naomi had entered the building. The investigation was already producing answers. What Naomi had not expected was how familiar the feeling would be. She remembered being 19 years old, sitting in a community clinic with her mother. They had waited nearly 4 hours while others were called ahead. Nobody explained why. Nobody apologized. Her mother had squeezed her hand and whispered something Naomi never forgot. Sometimes people decide who matters before they know your name. The memory returned now with startling clarity. Different city, different decade, same silence, same assumptions. Naomi slowly exhaled and adjusted in her chair. She was not angry. Anger could wait. Facts came first. Evidence came first. Truth came first. And somewhere inside that building, the truth was becoming harder for certain people to hide. By 7:23 a.m., the pattern was no longer subtle. It was visible. Naomi watched a man who had arrived nearly 15 minutes after her walk directly through the priority care doors after a brief conversation at the desk. Minutes later, another patient was escorted inside. Then another. Each time Melissa Grant smiled politely, tapped a few keys, and waved them forward. Each time Naomi remained in the waiting room. No explanation. No update. No urgency. Just silence. The silence was telling its own story now. Emily Brooks shifted in her chair again. She could see the appointment dashboard from her workstation. She could also see something Melissa apparently hoped nobody would notice. Naomi Carter's file carried an executive review flag, not a standard insurance notation, not a routine scheduling marker. It was a corporate designation reserved for high-level oversight visits and compliance evaluations. Emily blinked and checked again. The flag was still there. Then she watched Melissa open the file, stare at the notation, and quickly minimize the screen. A knot formed in Emily's stomach. Across the room, Naomi observed everything without appearing to observe anything. The waiting room had become a mirror. People revealed themselves when they thought nobody important was watching. A middle-aged woman seated nearby leaned toward Naomi. "Have they called your name yet?" she asked quietly. Naomi offered a small smile. "Not yet." The woman glanced toward the desk. "You were here before me." Naomi nodded once. The woman looked away, uncomfortable with the answer. At the reception counter, Melissa's confidence seemed to grow with every passing minute. She requested additional verification from Naomi's file, even though the documents had already been submitted electronically. Then she requested confirmation of information already confirmed. Each new step created another delay. Each delay created another excuse. Procedure had become a shield. The television continued playing health awareness messages overhead. Compassion, equity, access. The words drifted through the room with an irony nobody seemed willing to acknowledge. Then something happened that changed the atmosphere completely. An elderly black man entered the clinic using a cane. He approached the desk politely and explained that he had been instructed to report immediately for a follow-up evaluation. Melissa barely looked up. "Please take a seat," she said. Moments later, a younger white patient entered without an appointment and was immediately taken to an examination room after a brief conversation. The contrast landed heavily across the waiting area. Several people noticed. Nobody spoke. Emily looked from the screen to the patients and back again. Her expression tightened. This was not confusion. This was not a mistake. It was becoming a pattern too consistent to ignore. Naomi folded her hands and leaned back slightly. The room felt charged now, like air before a storm. She had spent years studying organizational failures. Most did not begin with dramatic scandals. They began with small decisions repeated so often that people stopped questioning them. One delay, one assumption, one patient treated differently than another. Eventually, those decisions became culture, and culture became policy without ever being written down. At the front desk, Melissa suddenly picked up Naomi's file again. This time her eyes narrowed. Then she reached for the phone beside her workstation. Whatever happened next, Naomi knew one thing with absolute certainty. Someone behind that desk had just realized there was more to her than they first assumed. Melissa Grant lowered the phone receiver slowly, but the tension in her face remained. Whatever she had heard on the other end of the line had not reassured her. If anything, it seemed to deepen her irritation. She glanced across the waiting room toward Naomi, then quickly looked away. The movement lasted less than a second. Emily Brooks noticed. So did Naomi. The difference was that Naomi understood exactly what it meant. Someone had finally looked deeper into the file. Someone had seen something they were not expecting. The waiting room continued operating under the illusion of normalcy. Patients arrived. Names were called. Doors opened and closed. Yet beneath the routine, pressure was building. Emily could feel it. She turned back toward her monitor and carefully reopened Naomi's record. The executive review flag remained active. So did several authorization markers she had never seen before. One carried a level of access usually reserved for corporate audits. Another referenced direct oversight protocols. Emily swallowed hard. She checked the patient name again. Naomi Carter. The name sounded familiar now, not because she had met her before, but because she had seen it somewhere. Annual reports, leadership newsletters, internal videos. The realization arrived gradually, like sunlight breaking through clouds. Emily's eyes widened. Across the room, Naomi sat calmly flipping through a health magazine she had not actually read. She did not need confirmation. She already knew the truth was working its way through the building. The question was who would acknowledge it first. Melissa suddenly stood and walked around the reception desk. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished floor. She stopped beside Emily's workstation. "Close that file," she said quietly. Emily looked up. "I was just verifying the appointment information." Melissa's expression hardened. "I said close it." The young employee hesitated. Only briefly. Then she minimized the screen. Melissa remained there another moment before returning to the front desk. The exchange was short, but several nearby patients noticed. One man lowered his newspaper. Another woman glanced toward Emily with concern. The atmosphere felt different now. Less like a clinic. More like a room waiting for something to happen. Emily stared at the monitor after Melissa walked away. Her pulse quickened. During her first week of orientation, supervisors had repeated the same principle again and again. Patient advocacy comes first. If something feels wrong, speak up. If a policy is being abused, report it. Yet now that moment had arrived, and speaking up suddenly felt much harder than it sounded in training. She looked across the room at Naomi. Calm, patient, observant. Then she looked toward the elderly man with the cane who was still waiting despite being told his appointment was urgent. Something inside her shifted. Small, quiet, permanent. Meanwhile, another secured door opened near the rear hallway. A tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped into view. Conversations softened almost immediately. Staff members straightened. Melissa's posture changed. The man moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. Richard Lawson, facility director, the highest-ranking administrator in the building. His eyes scanned the waiting room before settling on Naomi. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Richard walked directly toward the reception desk. Melissa leaned close and began speaking in a low voice. Whatever she was telling him, his expression darkened with every word. Emily watched the conversation unfold and felt her stomach drop. Because instead of correcting the situation, the director appeared ready to make it much worse. Richard Lawson listened as Melissa spoke in a hurried whisper beside the reception desk. His eyes never left Naomi. By the time Melissa finished, his expression carried the certainty of a man who had already made up his mind. He adjusted the cuff of his suit jacket and walked across the waiting room with deliberate confidence. Conversations faded around him. Staff members watched carefully. Patients looked up from their phones. Even the television seemed less noticeable now. Richard stopped directly in front of Naomi. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying far enough for nearby patients to hear. I understand there has been some confusion regarding your appointment. Naomi looked up calmly. Has there? Richard folded his hands. Priority services are reserved for patients who meet specific criteria. Our team has reviewed your case. Naomi held his gaze. And what conclusion did they reach? Richard smiled politely, but there was no warmth behind it. That you will need to continue waiting. The room grew quieter. Naomi nodded. Once. Interesting. Richard mistook her composure for surrender. Many people did. If the delay is a problem, he continued, there are several other facilities within 10 miles. The words landed heavily. Not because they were loud. Because they were intentional. Emily Brooks looked down at her desk. She could not believe what she was hearing. The executive review markers were still visible inside the system. Richard had either ignored them or decided they did not matter. Neither possibility was reassuring. Nearby, the elderly man with the cane shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A young mother frowned. The waiting room was beginning to feel less like a healthcare facility and more like a stage where everyone knew the script was wrong. Naomi remained seated, calm, unmoved. Richard interpreted the silence as an opportunity. In fact, he said, if you are dissatisfied with our process, you are free to leave at any time. Several people exchanged glances. Even Melissa appeared surprised by how far he was willing to push the situation. Naomi slowly stood. The movement drew every eye in the room. Richard seemed pleased. He believed he had won. What he did not understand was that Naomi had spent her entire career watching people reveal themselves. And Richard Lawson was revealing everything. For a brief moment, Naomi remembered another waiting room. She was 19 years old again. Her mother sat beside her holding a folded insurance form. They had waited for hours while other patients moved ahead. No explanations. No apologies. Only dismissive smiles and endless delays. Later that evening, her mother had looked exhausted as she sat in the passenger seat of their aging sedan. Never let people decide your worth before they know your name, she had said. Naomi carried those words through college, through boardrooms, through every acquisition and every challenge. Now, standing in this waiting room decades later, she could almost hear them again. Richard interrupted the memory. Do we understand each other? He asked. Naomi looked at him carefully, not with anger, not with frustration, with evaluation, the kind used before important decisions. Then she reached into her sweater pocket and removed her phone. Richard's smile faded slightly. Emily looked up. Melissa stiffened. The atmosphere shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakably. Naomi unlocked the screen, selected a contact, and lifted the phone to her ear. Good morning, Claire, she said calmly. Activate Compliance Protocol 7. The investigation is complete. The effect was immediate. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just immediate. Richard Lawson stared at Naomi as if he had misheard her. Melissa Grant froze behind the reception desk with one hand still resting on a stack of patient files. Around them, the waiting room seemed to hold its breath. Naomi listened quietly as the voice on the other end of the call responded. Protocol 7 confirmed, Claire said. Corporate compliance teams are active. Audit review is now underway. Naomi nodded once. Thank you. Then she ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Richard recovered first. A short laugh escaped him. Forced. Uncomfortable. I am not sure who you think you are calling, he said. But this facility follows established procedures. Naomi looked at him calmly. That is exactly what I am reviewing. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Melissa suddenly turned toward her workstation and began clicking through screens. Fast. Too fast. Naomi noticed. Richard noticed too. The confidence that had filled the room moments earlier was beginning to leak away. One of the reception monitors suddenly displayed a notification. Then another. Melissa's expression changed. She closed the window immediately, but not before Emily caught a glimpse of the message. Corporate compliance access authorized. Emily swallowed. The audit was real. Nearby, patients began exchanging uncertain looks. The elderly man with the cane watched quietly. The young mother shifted her child onto her lap. Nobody understood exactly what was happening, but everyone could feel it. The room no longer belonged to Richard Lawson. It belonged to the truth. Melissa attempted to regain control. This is ridiculous, she said. We have patients waiting. Naomi turned toward her. Some of them have been waiting longer than they should. Melissa opened her mouth, but found no response. Because the statement was not an accusation. It was a fact. At that exact moment, a new notification appeared on multiple administrative screens throughout the clinic. Audit lock initiated. Certain records became read-only. Access logs were preserved automatically. Internal communications were archived. Richard's face tightened. He stepped toward the reception counter and entered his credentials into a workstation. The system paused, then denied the request. A second attempt produced the same result. Emily saw it happen. So did Melissa. For the first time that morning, genuine concern appeared in Richard's eyes. Naomi remained perfectly still. The room seemed to revolve around her calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not issue threats. She simply allowed the system to do what it had been designed to do. Expose facts. One by one. The television continued playing cheerful healthcare advertisements overhead, but nobody was watching anymore. Every eye was fixed on the reception area. Then another alert appeared. This one impossible to ignore. Historical patient complaint files had been reopened for review. Melissa stared at the screen. Richard looked over her shoulder. Their reaction said everything. They had expected the complaints to stay buried. Instead, the files were surfacing all at once. Naomi watched the realization spread across their faces. The investigation was no longer beginning. It was closing. And somewhere beyond the walls of that clinic, teams of auditors, attorneys, and compliance officers were already reading documents that would change several careers before the morning was over. The waiting room had gone completely silent. Even the soft music drifting from the ceiling speakers seemed distant now. Richard Lawson stared at the administrative screen in front of him as new audit notifications continued appearing one after another. Melissa Grant stood frozen beside him. The confidence that had carried both of them through the morning was gone. In its place was uncertainty. Emily Brooks watched from her workstation, hardly breathing. She had never seen a corporate audit unfold in real time. Most employees never did. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she had been all morning. Calm, patient, unshaken. The difference now was that everyone in the room was watching her. A notification tone sounded again. Then another. Melissa clicked frantically through menus, attempting to regain access to files she had controlled for years. The system refused every request. Historical records were locked. Access logs were preserved. Internal communications were archived. Nothing could be altered now. Nothing could disappear. Richard turned toward Naomi. Who exactly are you? The question hung in the air. It was the first honest question anyone had asked her all morning. Naomi looked around the waiting room. She saw the elderly man still holding his cane, the young mother comforting her child, the patients who had watched the entire situation unfold without understanding why it felt wrong. Then she looked back at Richard. I am the person who received the complaints your patients sent when nobody here would listen. Nobody moved. Richard's expression tightened. Melissa glanced at Emily, then quickly away. Naomi continued. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. I did not come here seeking special treatment. Several people exchanged confused looks. Naomi took a step forward. I came here to find out why patients were being treated differently inside a facility my company owns. The words landed like a thunderclap. The room froze. For a moment, nobody seemed capable of reacting. Emily's eyes widened. The elderly man lowered his head in disbelief. A woman near the entrance placed a hand over her mouth. Richard simply stared. Naomi held his gaze. You spent the last 40 minutes explaining your policies to me. Silence. You delayed patients. Silence. You ignored complaints. Silence. And you told me to leave a healthcare facility that operates under my organization. Melissa's face lost color. Richard looked as though the floor beneath him had shifted. Across the room, realization spread from one person to another. The woman who had been sitting quietly among them was not simply another patient. She was the chief executive officer, whose signature appeared on the organization's annual reports, compliance standards, and patient care commitments. Naomi looked toward the reception desk. The problem is not that you did not know who I was. Her voice remained calm and precise. The problem is how you treated someone you believed did not matter. Nobody argued. Nobody could, because every person in the room had witnessed it. Every delay, every dismissal, every decision. The truth no longer needed evidence. It had witnesses. And for Richard Lawson and Melissa Grant, the consequences were only beginning. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The waiting room remained suspended in a silence so complete that even the clicking of keyboards had stopped. Richard Lawson stood motionless beside the reception desk, his authority unraveling in real time. Melissa Grant stared at the monitor in front of her as new compliance notifications continued arriving, one after another, each alert revealing another layer of oversight that had already moved beyond their control. Then Melissa's screen flashed red. Access suspended pending investigation. Her hands froze above the keyboard. Richard immediately stepped toward another workstation and attempted to log in using administrator credentials. The system rejected the request. He tried again. Denied. A third attempt produced the same result. Around the room, patients watched without saying a word. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were visible. Naomi Carter remained calm. The same calm she had carried from the moment she entered the building. The difference now was that nobody mistook it for weakness. A phone rang behind the reception desk. Melissa answered automatically. The color drained from her face within seconds. "Yes," she whispered. "I understand." She listened silently before lowering the receiver. Richard looked at her. "What is it?" Melissa swallowed hard. "Corporate compliance." The word seemed heavier than the room itself. Richard reached for the phone, but another notification interrupted him. This time it appeared across multiple administrative screens simultaneously. Immediate leadership review initiated. Facility director status. Suspended pending ethics investigation. Nobody needed an explanation. The message explained itself. Richard stared at the screen as though refusing to believe it existed. Across the waiting room, several patients exchanged stunned glances. The elderly man with the cane slowly shook his head. The young mother held her child closer. Emily Brooks looked from Naomi to the monitors and back again. She had never witnessed accountability arrive this quickly. Naomi finally stepped toward the reception area. Her voice remained steady. The complaints were not isolated incidents. Nobody interrupted her. The audit team reviewed patient reports before I arrived. What happened this morning confirmed the pattern. Melissa lowered her eyes. Richard said nothing, because the evidence was already speaking for them. Another call arrived. This one directed to Naomi. She answered and listened briefly. Then she nodded. "Thank you, Claire." The room waited. Naomi ended the call and looked toward Richard. "The Medical Oversight Board has received the preliminary findings." Richard's expression tightened. Naomi continued. "Your administrative license has been formally referred for emergency review." The words landed with finality. No shouting. No celebration. Just consequences. Melissa closed her eyes. Richard stared at the floor. Years of authority had collapsed in less than an hour because the foundation beneath it had never been as strong as they believed. Nearby, Emily noticed something else. The elderly man with the cane was finally being escorted toward an examination room. So were several patients whose appointments had been delayed. Quietly, almost unnoticed, the system was beginning to correct itself. And as the morning light filtered through the clinic windows, everyone in that waiting room understood they had witnessed something far larger than one investigation. They had watched a culture of indifference meet accountability face to face. And accountability had won. The waiting room looked different now. Not because the furniture had changed. Not because the rain outside had stopped. It looked different because the truth was finally visible. Patients who had spent the morning watching quietly were no longer staring at the reception desk. They were watching each other. Watching a system begin to correct itself. Watching accountability arrive without shouting, without drama, without excuses. Naomi Carter stood near the reception area as staff members moved quickly to assist patients whose care had been delayed. The elderly man with the cane disappeared through the examination doors at last. The young mother who had been waiting most of the morning was called moments later. Names that had been ignored were suddenly priorities. The change was immediate. And that was the point. When people wanted to do the right thing, they usually could. Emily Brooks stepped away from her workstation and approached Naomi carefully. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said quietly. Naomi looked at her and smiled. "You spoke up when it mattered." Emily lowered her eyes for a moment. "I was afraid." Naomi nodded. "Most people are." The young employee glanced toward the reception desk where administrative access remained suspended. "What happens now?" Naomi looked around the facility. "Now we rebuild trust." The answer was simple. Because the solution was never about punishment alone. It was about standards. The standards people chose to protect when nobody important seemed to be watching. Another call arrived from corporate headquarters. Preliminary findings had already triggered broader reviews across multiple locations. Additional patient complaints would be examined. New oversight measures would be implemented. Training programs would be updated. Systems would improve. The investigation that began in one waiting room was already reaching far beyond it. Naomi ended the call and looked across the lobby one final time. She thought about her mother, about the clinic they had sat in decades earlier, about every patient who had ever walked into a healthcare facility hoping to be treated with dignity instead of suspicion. Some memories stayed with people for a lifetime. The goal was to make sure new patients never had to create those memories at all. Several patients approached Naomi before leaving. Some thanked her. Others simply nodded. They did not need long conversations. They understood what they had witnessed. One woman paused near the entrance and said, "You changed this place today." Naomi shook her head gently. "The truth changed it. I just made sure someone listened." The woman smiled and walked out into the brightening Chicago morning. Gradually, the waiting room returned to normal. Phones came back out. Conversations resumed. The television continued playing health messages overhead. Yet something important had changed beneath the surface. The culture that had hidden behind procedure and silence had been exposed. And once exposed, it could no longer operate the same way. Naomi picked up her coat and prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, she turned back toward the room one last time. Her voice was calm, but every person nearby heard it clearly. Healthcare is not about who looks important. It is about who needs care. The moment we forget that, we fail the people we are here to serve. Then she walked out into the morning light, leaving behind a facility that finally understood the difference between power and responsibility. She had not raised her voice. She had raised the standard.